highlighting stories of inspiration and overcoming adversity. Ms. Borders has 3 decades of leadership, delivering results across the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. She is the CEO of LMB Group, LLC, a management consultancy firm, and recently chaired the Borders Commission, a strategic task force chartered by the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. Borders was the inaugural president and CEO's Time's Up, and formerly the president of the WNBA, where she is credited with accelerating the league's growth and creating new ways for fans to engage. Thank you all for being here. What a lineup.
Great to be here, Tiffany. Thanks for having us.
Of course. I want to jump in with one question that I'm going to ask for everyone. So you were all instrumental in the record turnout of voters in 2020. What did you hear from the field from your engagement from Black voters? What are they looking for from our elected officials? I'll start with you, Latasha. What are our folks looking for?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about this election, I think it was a pivotal moment for this entire country, that we have to really recognize that how COVID-19 impacted us, that we were in this racially tense environment where we're seeing hyperpolarization of political parties. What Black people, the Black voters that we've been talking to on the ground, they want power. It's not just about participation. It is having the power to be able to operate in their agency to make those decisions around who governs them and actually what conditions they're governed. We want what everybody else wants. We want better schools for our children. We want quality education.
No hashtags on this broadcast.
Quality health care. We want access to economic opportunity. We want a level playing field. And I think that when we're talking to voters, what they're saying is right now that as we've been talking to Black people, they've been saying that it's enough, that we have to do something around racial justice in this country. The killings must stop. We're tired and frustrated day after day seeing videos of another Black man, unarmed Black man or woman being shot down as dogs. And so fundamentally what we want initially, we want the killings and the murders and the discrimination against and attacks of our people to stop. But we also want a leadership that's going to be more reflective of the entire community, of an agenda that's actually going to lift up not just a few people in the community, but literally ultimately all of us, that working folks. When we're looking at Black women, 68% of Black women are wage workers. We need actually higher wages. We need to literally be able to have policy that's going to change the economic conditions in our community.
Yes, plus, as they say on the Zoom. President Johnson, what are NAACP members and folks in the community telling your organizers and field teams and young people? What do our folks want to hear from their elected officials?
Hello.
You know, the last 4 years under the administration demonstrated the urgency of more people in our community to be self-sufficient. They understood what was at stake, that our lives were at stake. The level of white supremacy that was coming from the White House, the boldness by which white supremacists would take to the street and actualize some of the rhetoric we had heard about for years. And as a result of that, you've seen record numbers of engagement across the board. You've seen record turnout. You've seen marches, demonstrations. And it's on top of what we witnessed with George Floyd, and on top of the economic crisis we found ourselves in as a community as a result of the health pandemic, where many of our workers were frontline workers and they were exposed to higher percentages. And the reality now is for more communities to truly take ownership of their destiny. Being self-sufficient is really important. That the words of Ella Baker, strong people don't need strong leaders because they're strong. It is the role of organizations and individuals to continue to provide information so people in local communities can be stronger, to be self-sufficient. The game of politics is just that. It is about who gets taxed and who's not taxed, and what those tax dollars are used for, how those platforms are being manipulated to drive questions of fear and create more tribalism. For the Black community, we have to cut through that. White supremacist behavior, it doesn't have a political party or home. It is. It is up for the Black community to be more self-determined, taking control of local politics, managing our votes, which is our currency in this democracy, so we can get the outcomes in terms of public policies that we are paying for. And we are owners of government, not victims of government, unless we sit back and let other people run the government against us. So for many people across the country, as we moved over this last 4 years, we heard people getting engaged, getting more involved. They weren't caring about political affiliation. They seen the urgency of participation because white supremacists had so dominated the Republican Party, it left them no other choice than vote in record numbers in 2018, and then again in 2020, and then again during the runoff election in January in Georgia. Being strong, self-sufficient. Strong people don't need strong leaders, so we're already strong.
Ella Baker is one of my spirit guides, I like to believe, and I believe that's true, President Johnson. Lisa, so I'm sure you heard similar things to Latasha and Derek, but our community isn't a monolith. So while you may have heard similar things, I'm sure you heard other things. Can you touch on what you feel like you heard and understood people wanted from elected officials?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Tiffany. But first, let me salute Latasha and Derek, and let me co-sign what they've already said and lift up the organizations that they're leading. Because one of the things that people are telling me in the Black community, but also women of every stripe, because, I had the privilege of leading the WNBA, and the players were deeply engaged in the civic process and the voting process during the fall and into the runoff, particularly in our home state of Georgia. What folks are telling us is that they feel disenfranchised. They don't feel seen and heard. So that's consistent with what Latasha and Derek are talking about. But what I also hear is equally aligned where people are saying, wait a minute, this is on us. We got this, to step forward, step up, and articulate what the disparities are, where we are disenfranchised and why, how the playing field should be level. All this notion of the laws that folks are trying to pass in these 46 states, there's like 350 of them.
Why does it say connection timed out, or is that before?
Handling voter suppression. What I would say, and I am hearing said, is that there is recognition that we are standing up and standing out. We heard Dr. Bernice King talk about her father, and one of the things he said was, a man can't stand on your neck if you stand up. So what I recognize and what folks are telling me is that they're standing up, particularly young people, those that are 18 to 35 who perhaps didn't understand the urgency of now, looking at things that are coming at us over the transom. They're coming at all of us, not one of us. To Leader Abrams' point, white supremacy comes in all stripes, and it's all across the country. We are not having, maybe we have the tip of the spear in the South, but we are not the only people who are seeing it or experiencing it. So what I'm hearing from the athletes that I work with, Black folks all across the country, even CEOs, is that we're going to stand up, we're going to push back, and we're not going to take it anymore. Period. Full stop.
I'm 100% with that, and that's why we're here tonight. We got 100 days to push this rock up and over the hill, so I love to hear that. I'm going to turn to you, Latasha. I have a question for you. Since the 2020 election, over 300 new voter suppression bills have been introduced around the country. What has led us as a democracy to this current crisis?
There's a couple of points, that I'll make quickly around it. The first thing is every time we literally look at the history of America. Anytime there has been an advancement, Black progress in this country, there has been a white backlash. We can go from Reconstruction. We can go from the 20s with the rise of the lynchings. We can go to what happened that led to the Civil Rights Movement, and on and on and on. And so part of what we have to really recognize is this ain't just about voting. This is about structural racism. And this is about the protection, the creation around literally every system in this country has been designed in such a way to protect white interests, right? And so part of not wanting people to participate in the process isn't just about about a party grab. It's not just about the Republicans. This is literally about the Republicans leading a charge to say that we're going to literally, as they said in the past, take the country back, i.e. meaning we're going to create a circumstance that white men with wealth, and where does that remind us of, right, will actually maintain and have all disproportionate the power in this country. And so part of, even when we're talking about the voter suppression bills that we're seeing come across all, it's a punitive measure. It is to punish Black folks and people of color from coming out in record and historic numbers. But it's also literally to actually make people feel dejected and make people feel powerless and make people not engage in the process. The thinking is, if we actually continue to do this and beat folks down, which is the way that oppression works, that folks will disengage in the process. On the contrary, one of the things I think white supremacists continue to do, where one of their biggest mistakes is they continuously underestimate Black folks, the power, and the passion of Black people. And so fundamentally what we saw is in 2018, we saw voter suppression firsthand, right? Georgia was ground zero for voter suppression. So what happened? What was our response to it? In 2020, it wasn't like the voter suppression stopped. It continued. Matter of fact, in many ways, it intensified on top of actually having COVID-19. But what did we do? Literally, movement did this. That fundamentally what we did, we came out even harder. And so when we're looking at the runoff election, the runoff was specifically designed to march for Black voters, one, for the Negro vote, to actually have a drop-off. What did we do? We came out in large numbers. My point is, there is a response where we're hearing folks are tired. And the communities that we're talking to, that people are centering out, they're not waiting for the best candidate or the best political party to actually come and save them. That people are having a sense, as Derek talked about earlier, of self-determination, that literally we are radically reimagining every single system in this country, and we're going to make sure that we have our agency is respected and our voice is heard.
Yes.
Absolutely. Positively. We cannot stop that fight. Our voices are why we're here tonight, right? Because we know, turning to you, Lisa, that if these laws that are directly assaulted and attacks on our communities are passed, then we won't be able to do the kind of grass tops to grass roots organizing that you were talking about. So can you touch on that a little bit? I know you organized some really awesome folks to join the Joy to the Polls and different actions in the 2020 and the runoff. So what happens if they get their way? How does that stop or interfere with our work?
Well, it stifles our work in many ways. And the athletes that I was working with last summer, these were women from the W who stood up and stood out and went on national TV and said, we got to vote, we got to support Georgia. Many of them did not live in Georgia, but they understood what was happening conceptually and at a practical level. To Latasha's point, in Georgia, we were ground zero, we are ground zero, because SB 202 passed here, so it is law here. And so what we have to do is not only marshal the resources that we saw with individual players or teams or folks in the sports industry, we got to get corporations to step up and speak up and be honest about what's actually happening. That's number one, because we understand this is happening in Florida, Georgia, Texas, Arizona, Michigan. Like, what the hell? Like, we have got to step in the gap. So the corporations, number one, got to acknowledge it. Every leader, be they business, political, or civic, has got to open their mouth. You cannot sit on the sidelines and say, I'll do something next time. There's the urgent moment is right here, right now. So that's number one. Number two, money that is earmarked for all the campaign contributions that they've been given. Why are they going to fund people, or why should they fund people who are threatening democracy? That's a threat to their company. So let's call it an economic threat, not just a democratic threat, but it is. If we need to appeal to what makes their companies run, Tiffany, I'm okay with that. So rather than spend that money on folks who are not seeing us and not representing us, give that money to the poor or the elderly or students or those who are isolated that will need IDs to vote in the 2022 elections. That's the second thing they can do. The money's already earmarked, so let's redeploy it. And then number three, Leader Abrams talked about HR1 and want to for the People Act. Okay, come on, that's a standard, a federal standard that will put all this stuff at the state level to rest, right? That's number one. So whether it's expanding early voting or same-day voting, a national registry for voter registration, things that none of us can really argue with except those who want to centralize power and eliminate the rest of us. So if corporations would step up and support For the People Act and demand that it be passed along with the John Lewis Voting Advancement Act, which clearly will reinstate pre-clearance. And for those who are not clear on what pre-clearance is, that means whenever a state wants to change voting instructions and voting laws and voting rules, it has to be cleared by the Department of Justice. Because half of this stuff, people are trying to not only stay in power, but have an even broader power grab. Tiffany, we know in Georgia, for example, they removed the Secretary of State as part of the process. And now they can appoint a partisan person. What are you talking about right now? Okay, and that is law in Georgia, and they're trying to do the same thing, Florida, Texas, you name it. So corporations have a big part to play. The players from the WNBA were bold as brass, and I'm mighty proud of those women. Back to Dr. Bernice A. King, who said women are leading the charge. No disrespect to our male counterparts, but we are inviting everybody into this arena, starting with the corporations, because they've got big blocks of people that they control and that they inform and can help push this change that we are talking about for more equitable treatment of all people, Black and brown communities, first among equals.
Yes, thank you for that, Lisa, because that's part of our goal over these next 100 days. We're going to let folks know exactly who they can target, exactly who we need to be talking to. It's more than a black square, right? It's time to put your money and your resources where your mouth is and demonstrate to us that our Black lives matter. So thank you for that and for setting us up for the question I'm about to toss to President Johnson, to actually get into those two pieces of legislation and help folks understand. Can we talk about the federal legislation that could at least mitigate and stop some harm that these state level bills will cause? First, For the People Act, S1, what would the bill do and how will it help make voting more accessible and combat some of the things that Lisa was just highlighting?
Great question. So if we're able to move this piece of legislation, it will address in all 50 states the issue of voter registration, and anyone who applies for any state services, whether it's driver's license or you name it, you automatically register to vote. Voter registration within itself is vote suppression. It would allow for up to 15 days of early voting. It would open up the opportunity for mail-in voting. It will create spaces where it's easier to vote. That's really important. In this democracy, we celebrate if over 60% of the population actually vote. However, in other countries, Australia, 96% of the population vote. Canada, just to the north of us, 92% of the population votes. Germany, 93% of the population vote. We don't have a true representative democracy when you have policymakers trying to pick their voters as opposed to voters picking their policymakers, and voters pick their policymakers when you open up access to voting. So it's really important for us to move this piece of legislation because it makes it easier for more people to vote so we can get to a place of representative democracy. Now, if you add that on top of the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, which is so important, particularly to southern jurisdictions. It was created out of 1965 Voting Rights Act. It was a test that it would apply to jurisdictions, whether states in whole or jurisdictions within states, who've had a demonstrated history of seeking to suppress the Black vote. And when the court struck it down, it opened the door to states like Georgia or South Carolina or Alabama to go backwards in access to voting in terms of the voting laws. And so we are living in the reality of those laws being put in place, causing Stacey Abrams not to be named the next governor in 2018 because she won that election, won for the thievery that took place. It created a different dynamic in a state like South Carolina, where had some of the restrictive measures not been put in place, it would have created a more competitive environment for someone like a Jamie Harrison, or in a state like Alabama, and when the countless local elections that were either too close to call or went in the wrong direction because it didn't truly reflect the will of all the voters, not just the ones who figured out how to navigate their ballot, but the ones who were denied access to the ballot. So when you look at H.R. 1 and then you add in H.R. 4, where you have a pre-clearance requirement, where the changes of election laws, policies, or practices would not be allowed unless there's a review and it's clear by the Justice Department to ensure those changes would not have a disparate impact.
Hashtag not trending.
Thank you, President Johnson. Thank you for such a clear and sharp explanation of that. Again, that's what we're going to spend our whole summer doing, is making sure folks realize and remember, right, that we have living, breathing examples of what happens when we don't have these laws. We've seen elections stolen from us. We've seen the sweeping changes happening right under our noses, and this is why we have to continue to fight. And so, Latasha, I'll ask you, we have the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, H.R. 4, that President Johnson just mentioned, named after the late civil rights icon who we know was beaten within seconds of his life trying to overcome this fight decades ago, and it just breaks my heart that we're here again. But can you give a little bit more context to our folks and let them know what would H.R. 4 do to actually fix the gutted 1965 Voting Rights Act?
So, I want to talk about both H.R. 4 and the For the People Act, because I think we need to see them as companion bills, that we need both. Because what For the People Act does is it actually addresses some of the things that I think has really undermined politics in the country. And so when we're looking at For the People Act, we're looking at the expanding of early voting. We're lessening the voter ID requirements, that states will actually be able to do automatic voter registration. All states will have early voting. There are states currently right now that don't offer in-person early voting, but it also deals with dark money. It also deals with gerrymandering, which has been weaponized against Black communities with surgical precision, according to the courts in North Carolina. And it also deals with, as we're talking about, a redistricting in the gerrymandering process. It also literally deals with how we kind of move forward in terms of literally oversight around our elections. In addition to that, when we're talking about the John Lewis Advancement Act, which many of us don't realize, it sets up a new formula. That the formula, as Derek had talked about earlier, that there was a formula that was set up that certain states, that the Supreme Court essentially in this last ruling in 2013, when they got it, said, no, we don't need that. Just fix it, but it's fine. We don't need that anymore. Right? There's a preponderance of evidence now. Everything the voter advocates said would happen, not only has it happened, but it's actually intensified to the worst of our imaginations. And so it sets up a different formula that is actually not just directed at states in the South. There's been egregious actors to this process. So literally in other states and states all around the country, in the West, in the East, and in the North, and the Midwest. And so it sets up a different kind of formula that does bring a different level of parity, I think, in terms of some of the states and across the country. It also expands voting rights to Native Americans. Most people don't know that in the Voting Rights Act, it did not explicitly include the Native American communities. Right? Many of them have also been experiencing voter suppression in the form of their laws have been set up where in some of the states, when you look out west, where many Native American communities and reservations, they use post office boxes. And so there's legislation that was set up that would not allow post office boxes, so that would actually discriminate against them. Right? And so what we're looking at, I think the thing that is most powerful is that it restores Section 5, basically the pre-clearance clause. If that act, for people to understand, if I boil it down, we need people to understand that if the John Lewis Voter Advancement Act was in place, the Georgia bill never would have been able to pass. That many of the bills that we're talking around in the states that are going on right now in all of 47 states, they would not actually be able to cut the mustard. right, that there would be some more oversight around the elections and these election laws that are being passed at a rapid amount of time within the country. And so I think it's really important for people to know that we have to actually push forward, that even in the 1965 Voting Rights Act, just to put it in context, that was never the end all and be all. That was a compromise in itself. Even the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had to be reauthorized every 25 years. We need something, not even we stop just with those things. Right now, in the immediate, we need the John Lewis Act and the For the People Act. But I also believe that we need a Department of Democracy. I also think that we need to make sure that voting rights is actually included in the Constitution. I also think that we need different vehicles and tools that are used as well, as we're talking about race choice voting and other ways that we can actually have more representative and more reflective democracy.
I don't know if I could support a Department of Democracy if you're not in charge, Latasha. Thank you so much for that. And also thank you for reminding us that we absolutely have to see them as going hand in hand. And that's something we have to remind our folks. One really isn't going to do us that much good if we don't have the other. And so remember, folks, we need the John Lewis Voting Advancement Act and we need the For the People Act. So President Johnson's going to stay on with us. But before you and Lisa depart, I'd like to ask each of you very quickly, give us one thing that you want to make sure that our audience is doing this summer to make sure we get this rock over the hill. Lisa, I'll start with you. One thing that you want everybody in the audience to make sure they do.
I want everybody in the audience to persevere, Tiffany, because to the point of all the things that have happened in 2020 and 2021, starting with the pandemic, but followed up by all of this adverse action that we are seeing, that is clear evidence that we are making incremental progress, which is not to be understated. So we've got to keep our eye on the prize, the two pieces of legislation that Latasha so eloquently spoke about and Derek is speaking about. We have to stay focused on what's most important, and that's ensuring that those two pieces of legislation, at least in the short term, help solve the acute issue. So persevere, persevere, persevere.
Well, the first thing I did right was the day I started to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize and hold on. Just as Sister Lisa just said, we got to keep our eyes on the prize. We've got to organize. Organized power is realized power. And when we're looking at with mighty trees, it doesn't matter how great their branches are. If they're not rooted, if they're not grounded, their roots are not strong, they will not survive, they will not live. And so it's important for us to support grassroots organizations, grassroots groups that are doing the work. If you send a check for $5, $20, $100, but support the work that's going on the ground. That's where the real work happens. That's where the real transformational change happens.
Let the church say amen.
Amen. And we got a song from Natasha Brown. Y'all can check Natasha out on Spotify too.
I ain't mad at her. I'm loving it. That's part of the movement is the music.
Amen. Lisa, Latasha, we are blessed and so grateful to have you with us tonight. I promise you, the front line is just honored that you came through. Thanks for your panel. Have a wonderful evening.
God bless.
God bless.
Cool, folks. So we got some marching orders. And right now, we're going to pause for just one moment to allow our amazing ASL interpreters, Matt and Oral, to switch out. We're so grateful for this work to make this event more accessible. So just hold tight for us.
I asked if there was a replay because I didn't hear Stacey Abrams, but nobody said yes or no.
Are we ready to go? We're ready, and we're back now with Oral. Hey, Oral. So voting rights are critical, but voting is not the only way we exercise power or make change. Throughout history, grassroots social movements, specifically protesting and taking to the streets, has been one of the most effective ways that we've gotten to change. It's not an accident that along with voter suppression laws, Republicans are also pushing over 45 bills across America to criminalize protests and protesters. It's another piece of their effort to keep Black folks disenfranchised, and we're very clear on that. As I said, President Johnson was gracious enough to stick around with us, and now we're going to be joined by two more outstanding movement leaders, Cliff Albright and Valencia Gruder. Valencia Gunder. Valencia Gunder, or is most recognized her V, which is why I said Gunder because I usually just call her V, is an enthusiastic, self-motivated, and driven community organizer. A Miami native, Valencia is the founder and co-director of Smile Trust Inc., co-founder of the Black Collective, and national organizing lead of the Red, Black, and Green New Deal for the Movement for Black Lives, and advocate in residence at Florida Memorial University. Valencia assists many community-based organizations with a variety of strategies around Florida to ensure that the community feels the impact in a positive way. Cliff Albright is a 2020 Soros Equality Fellow and co-founder of Black Voters Matter Fund, which builds community and organizational capacity related to Black voting power. In 2018, Cliff and the Black Voters Matter team traveled throughout 7 southern states in the blackest bus in America. I love that. Energizing voters and exposing voter suppression. Cliff hosts a weekly radio show in Atlanta and has served as an instructor of African American studies at several universities. Welcome, Cliff. Thank you for being here. Welcome, V. How are you today? Good to see you, sis. I'm going to jump right into discussion questions because we're almost like right on time, which never happens. We heard from Dr. Bernice King, which was still floating, about the historical significance of protest and its connection to protecting our vote. How does protest fit into this latest iteration on the fight for Black liberation, President Johnson?
Black liberation is our total need. As we talk about democracy, that's just a vehicle to get to self-determination. And self-determination should always be the direction we go in. We're not a monolithic community. We have much diversity, but through our uniqueness, we all should be driving towards our ability to be self-determined. In that is liberation. In that is an opportunity to allow our voices to be heard through this democracy. This democracy is something that we have invested in. This democracy is something we have set up and never been compensated for. This democracy is what we own. And to have Black liberation is to be able to exist in it, however we decide within the confines of it, or to be able to remove ourselves from it, if we so choose. That is about being self-determined. And being self-determined is liberation. It is Black liberation.
I couldn't agree with you more, President Johnson. And so, Cliff, let me ask you, if that's part of our self-determination and that's part of our liberation fight, then what are the consequences of a society that doesn't allow us to do that?
Yeah, I mean, quite simply, a society that does not allow us to do that, can no longer exist. And I don't mean that like figuratively or metaphorically. You can't sustain a society where you do not allow protesting, or you can't even create a society. Think about it. This nation was founded on protests, right? You got some people that climb on a boat and spill some tea out into the Boston Harbor. You want to call them patriots and freedom fighters, but you get a little graffiti that says BLM on the building, and you want to act like they're terrorists and criminals, right? And so you can't sustain a situation where you don't allow protests, especially when you combine it with the last discussion that we just had. If you're going to take away the right to vote, right, the traditional way, the acceptable and the respectable way that we can influence politics and control our lives, if you're going to limit that through all these bills that are being passed, through the ongoing gerrymandering and everything else that takes place, and then you're also going to take away the right to protest, then what are people left with? Right? Where do you expect people to go? A society that does not allow for that kind of protest, especially by those who are marginalized, like I said, can no longer exist. Power conceives nothing without a demand. A demand is going to be made one way or another. If you're going to limit the ways that can happen, then that doesn't lead you to a good situation. The other quick thing I just wanted to add, just in terms of like where this protest fits in. There's been a lot said about how the protest fits in the sense of we know that without the historic summer of protest, we might not have gotten to the verdict that we got last week. Heck, we might not have even gotten to a trial in the Chauvin case, right? And so we know the role that the historic summer protest played in that. But there's another piece to it. It's not just where the protest fits into our current situation. It's where it fits into our ongoing story, our ongoing narrative, right? This ongoing battle that we have. Because at the end of the day, that summer of protest and the protest that we're doing right now against these vote suppression bills, these protest bills, is part of the ongoing narrative that lets future generations know that we did not accept the oppression that was coming our way. The same way that people will try to tell you a lie about enslaved Africans, and those lies are betrayed by the fact that you had routine work slowdowns or routine runaways, or that you had Sister Harriet, or that you had Brother Nat and Brother Denmark. You can't tell that lie because our protest speaks to the truth. You can't tell the lie that we were happy with Jim Crow because the protest, you had Dr. King on earlier, the protest of her father, her mother, and all the others in that generation speaks to the truth. You will not be able to, in some future generation, tell the lie that Black folks sat back and allowed ourselves, our families, our children to be murdered, and that we did not resist, right? Because the summer of protest and all the other protests that we do, and all of the Black Lives Matter and everything else, speaks to the truth. So it's not just where it sits in our current or present situation, and what it means to future generations.
And to let me add one thing, is understand, protest is a tool. It's not an outcome. It is a tool when our voices are not being heard. It is a tool when we're unable to exercise our self-determination through our voice in this system.
How much of a delay is there?
Always recognize it for the tool it is, and no protest within itself is not the outcome.
That's absolutely right. And as you put it in that historical context, Tim, I'm going to turn it over to Valencia, who's actually living the horrors of this right now in Florida. And we're sending lots of love to you because we know that this could literally be the difference between you being able to execute program and moving community the way that our folks want to. So I'd love to hear you talk about the effects of that right now in Florida, anti-protest bills popping up, and particularly how this feels on the ground right now.
Yeah, well, thank you for calling me the anti-protest bill. The government is trying to push this narrative of an anti-riot bill. This is anti-protest. The definition of the riot is 9 or more folks gathered together. That could be a birthday party, a backyard barbecue, and it gives the officer the discretion to call it a riot. And it's sickening. It's so many different parts of the legislation. The anti-protest piece of it is disheartening, right? It is an attempt to scare people into not acting, to not using the tool of protest to bring awareness to issues that we're having, and also to hold our local and state government accountable for all of the mistreatment that they do to our communities. But on top of that, this bill was loaded with more stuff, right? One, it preempted all local law enforcement budgets to be controlled by our state, right? So that was a direct attack on our call to action to defund the police, right? As taxpayers, we have a right to weigh in on our budget process. It took away that right? And then it also carried the mandatory minimum with the 5th-degree felony, or the mandatory minimum to serve 6 months. And if you are a leader of the movement, you get charged under the RICO Act, and you carry a mandatory minimum of 15 years. Now, what does that look like for a Valencia gun, right? That looks like if I go out of protest and a police officer says that I was inciting the riot, and I am a leader, and I just got my rights back to vote in 2018 under Amendment 4.
I'm trying.
I'm a citizen, a 2-time felon, right? That means I'll have a third strike with a mandatory minimum of 15 years. And I may never see the outside of a cage ever again for me trying to hold the government accountable for the harm that they do to community, right? That is the reality of it all. But what's even worse is that our government, the extreme right, is controlling the narrative here in the state of Florida with our residents. People are like, yeah, we don't agree with burning buildings. I don't know when we got to this place, but we value buildings and infrastructure and roads over somebody's life. And it's been a headache here trying to combat our governor. He's out of control.
You can't hear it, can you?
And we're dealing with it firsthand. But we haven't given up, Tiffany. We haven't given up. We've been canvassing, educating our communities, doing outreach, and of course, we're going to see them in the courts.
I know that's right. And so right now,
you can see it, but you can't hear that feed, right?
Very powerful firsthand account. People need to know what's happening in Florida. What can we do? What can this community do to support folks in Florida right now? What is your call to action?
Yes, if you go to the blackcollective.org, that's the blkcollective.org, and you can sign on to our letter against it. We're working in coalition with over 24 organizations across the state to stand up against this. And honestly, we are asking people to help flank us as we will maybe need to escalate soon. And for our national folks and our folks from our neighboring communities to be able to come in and support us if we need so.
Okay, I'm going to turn this. I'm going to turn this off and see if you can hear. Wow. I'm checking to see if you can hear anything. You can't hear it. You can't hear it. You can see it, but you can't hear it. You can see it, but you can't hear it. What if I? All right, I'll